Ivan Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 4, Part 2.5, Lychany, read by Natalia Buzova. The village of Lychany was traditionally considered Bandera village. At one time, it was part of the area of activity of the Kurin Ataman Zhuk, a native of Olika. Back in 1942, the leaders of the OUN Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists carried out a mobilization in Western Ukraine to fight for independent Ukraine. They had their own military structure: Zagrava Division, Kurin Regiment, Chota Company. The security service had a separate structure. Its primary unit in the villages was Boyivka. While the war was going on, they fought against the Germans and Soviet partisans, and after the war against the Soviet government, which was called Moscow and Occupation One. Among the forest people, there were many from Lychany. It was hard to fight them. During the day, they worked peacefully on their own farm, and at night, with weapons in their hands, they went to carry out combat missions to neutralize the Soviet activists, disrupt collectivization, etc. Some of them, especially known to the KGB, lived permanently in the forests and hid in the catchers. The local population sympathized with them and supplied them with food. Some Bandera detachments existed until 1955, when the KGB and military units managed to completely eliminate their leadership cadres, and then the last scattered combat groups. Some fell in unequal battles, others were shot by military courts or without them, and others were sent to prison and to logging in the taiga. Those who managed to hide their forest past began to grow into peaceful life. Today, attitudes towards former UPA soldiers are different. Some call them fighters for independent Ukraine, others proclaim them enemies. I'm sure that history will not only justify them and remove their labels, but will also place them next to such legendary figures as the Haidamaks. Poland at one time made a lot of efforts to portray the Haidamaks as thieves and robbers. The same slander is leveled against the UPA soldiers and the Soviet Russian by the Soviet Russian great powers. These attempts can be answered with lines from Taras Shevchenko's poem Cold Ravine. You are lying, man. The robber will not stand out for the holy truth. It should be noted that the peasants of Western Ukraine lived better financially than in the eastern regions. For example, my native Poltava region was perhaps the richest in the Soviet Union in terms of the fertility of its black soils. And our people are economical and hardworking, but no matter how hard they worked, all the fruits of their labor were raked into bottomless state bins. Frightened by the famine and repressions, oppressed by taxes and loans, the peasants silently agreed with Stalin's serfdom and lived in great poverty and lack of rights. As for the rebellious Western Ukraine, the state pursued a pie and stick policy here. People were deported en masse to Siberia, killed, imprisoned, and provided at the same time with some benefits. They were not forced, like us, to the hated collectivization. They were exempt from certain taxes or deferred their payment for several years. In the first post-war years, there were no collective farms here. The peasants worked on their own land, and as they say, had bread on the table and food to go with it. It was in those years that famine was raging in the eastern regions, and our people went to Westerners for cheap grain, and some simply begged in their villages, thereby illustrating what Stalinist socialism really was. After a 2-year stay in Volyn in August 1962, I went to Yashniki. Chesnik complained that the tomatoes had grown well, but there was nowhere to sell them, and you couldn't get more than 20 kopecks per kilogram. I suggested taking them to Volyn, where fewer of them were grown, since they did not ripen well in a humid climate. and imported ones could be sold for 50 kopecks. That's what we decided on. On a certain day, 2 lorries, loaded boxes with red-sided goods, hit the road. One was led by my cousin Anatoly Petrovich Pavlenko, and the second by a neighbor on the street, Grigory Vasilyevich Halivets. We sat in the cabins with the foreman of the gardening brigade, Stepan Mikhailovich Sokolovsky, also a comrade of my youth. It went fine. The road was asphalt, smooth. Only in Kiev did we have an accident. We crossed the city at midnight. There were no more lorries or people on the streets. Therefore, in some places, we did not pay attention to traffic lights. Go, I urged Toля. There are thousands of them here. If we stop in front of everyone, we would get out of the city until the morning. And Toля did. Suddenly, a car with policemen jumped out from the alley as if from an ambush. Stop! Why are you running a red light? Where's your driving license? Then I instantly realized what needed to be done and began to say that this was our first time in Kiev and we didn't see a traffic light, that we were bringing tomatoes from the collective farm and could give them too. I saw that the stern law enforcement officers softened and then unceremoniously selected 10 kilograms of tomatoes and left. We also arrived in Lychany safely. We had dinner and went to bed. The next day, 1 lorry of tomatoes was handed over to the Tsumань store for 50 kopecks per kilogram, and the second one was sold at the bazaar in Oleka. I always looked after my fellow countrymen and helped sell the goods. And a year before that, my cousin Ivan Andreevich, Stepan Golub, Vasil Petrovich Davydenko, Stepan Sokolovsky, and Marfa Zinchenko came from Yashniki by collective farm lorry to buy cows for themselves. In Lokhvitsa, after Strelets executions, the peasants were left without cows and without the promised collective farm milk. And when his arbitrariness was stopped, people began to look for cows for themselves in the bazaars. But they were now rarely sold there, and their price almost doubled in a year. I had to go to the Westerners. They successfully bought them at the first market in Oleka. It must be said that the Westerners had not yet lived up to the total socialism that oppressed the Eastern Ukrainians. Having some benefits, they kept several heads of cattle and pigs on their own farm, which they sold at the market. And for the money, they built new houses, barns, etc. for themselves. In Lychany, I also had my own garden of about 0.30 hectares. In spring, I delivered humus, added mineral fertilizers, and enough potatoes were produced for my family, 2 pigs, and also 2 tons of potatoes were sold to the Donbas people who bought them here.